Welcome to today's webinar, Building the Story of Quality, Integration, Harmonization, and Risk-Based Thinking, sponsored by ETQ. I'm Dirk Ducharme, Editor-in-Chief for Quality Digest and your host for today's webinar. So more and more quality management systems are becoming a strategic component of businesses' digital strategies, and they're touching more and more of the business. It's not just the quality department anymore. The QMSs expand into all areas of your company. And with updated standards like ISO 9001 and related QMSs now including risk practices and the enrollment of all people in the quality management effort, the need for cohesion from one system over one system is more critical than ever. So in today's webinar, we're going to take a look at the story of quality, the chain of quality's impact on various areas of the business, and how those operational areas rely on quality-based information to gain visibility and control, how they impact operations with an eye to quality and create a hub of quality throughout the design, production, supply chain, and post-market. Before I introduce today's speaker, as I said, just a reminder that at any time you can send questions to us using the Q&A box. The Q&A box is in the lower right corner of your screen, or if you see a green pull-down menu at the top of your screen, click that, and you will see a Q&A button that you can click to open the Q&A box. A recording of this webinar, as well as a copy of the slides, will be available one day after the webinar, so you can keep your eye open for an email on that. Okay, today's presenter is Tim Lozier, Director of Product Strategy for ETQ. He has an extensive experience in the software industry and has been involved in the creation of leading-edge technologies in user interface design and development. Tim began his career in digital marketing before taking a turn into software design and marketing at Cork Incorporated. Today, he helps foster the development of leading quality management software solutions. Okay, Tim, go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Dirk. And good day, everybody. Thanks for attending today's webinar. So today, we're going to talk about a few things, really. We're going to talk about the mindset of quality and how companies are looking at quality in a larger scope of the different individuals that are involved. We're also going to look at some of the challenges in getting that more enrollment and how we can kind of eliminate the clutter that might exist and have better conversations around quality and really create a true story of quality. So to do that, there's three elements that I highlighted, and I think there's more, but I think these are kind of key elements. And these would be around the idea of harmonizing your processes into a common framework, integrating more business systems into that story of quality, and looking at how we can basically level the playing field with risk-based thinking. And one of the things that I look at when I kind of start looking at what quality is and who we are as an organization with respect to quality, there's a story there. And you think about the traceability and the visibility and the control that you need to have in quality, and it'll start at design, it'll move on to production, it'll move on to supply chain and logistics, it'll move into the post-market, and then it'll go into how post-market closes that loop and reintroduces changes. And so when you start to think about when you're trying to explain how quality moves through those different operational areas, what's that story? What's the story of how a complaint turned into an investigation, turned into a corrective action? How did it turn into a management of change initiative, and how are you tracking that? So those are the kind of areas that I see as a story that we can combine and have more stakeholders be a part of. And like I said, in order to do that, you really need to make sure the process is harmonized across all those areas. You need to make sure that business systems are talking to each other to round out that story. And you need to kind of level that playing field where how do you speak in terms that everybody can understand, and risk becomes that way. So let's go ahead and start in with what we're going to talk about today. So I think a good place to kind of start is that this whole idea that quality is really not considered a singular departmental concept anymore. And if you look at the ISO 9001:2015 standard, it seems that they're tending to agree on that. And we started following these updates to the standard, and what we saw was it wasn't necessarily all about the requirements, but a company mindset to quality. Now, of course, the requirements drive that framework, and it's how you map your business to the standard. But 2015 takes a broader stroke in really explaining the overall goals and the mindset quality should take into your operations. It's not necessarily a change in the requirements per se, but the approach you take to satisfy them. And so you think about the mindset change in the people and the leaders within your organizations. There's no specific requirement around a quality management representative or even a quality manual, which becomes a shift, but it focuses a lot on company-wide commitment around quality and the leaders within the organization that are going to drive in line with quality. So you think about that and you say, okay, well, if we're all enrolled in the quality management effort and we need to collaborate on our own part in the quality story, how can we do that in a centralized, common system, and where does this whole risk thing fit in? Where does harmonization fit in? Well, let's kind of take a step back here and think about where we're at today. And so the comment I would make here is are we making it harder on ourselves than it needs to be? And so if you think about the way we process information around quality and compliance, is it clear and central, or are we referencing data from all various places? A recent study I was reading the other day said that human beings as a whole consume about 34 gigabytes of information a day across multiple data points. That's a lot of information. And when a quality issue arises, how are we keeping information like that, as well as the communication around that, how are we keeping it all central and collaborative? Often getting from point A to point B can involve multiple methods. You think about emails and files and spreadsheets and comments and all sorts of things. The challenge becomes one of keeping track. So what are we tracking and how are we tracking it? And when you look at it, you kind of want to have that clear and concise conversation or story of compliance and quality. So the communications and actions taken in your processes need to be tracked, but they need to be common, and they also need to be simple for multiple different stakeholders to leverage. So this way, all the communications around executing on quality processes, compliance processes, they're not disparate. They're clear and they're traceable. So we come to the central story of quality. And so, by virtualizing, by virtue of centralizing our quality effort and tracking in one place and communicating more effectively, we can now have a single logical place where all our conversations and the story can happen. And you certainly have various different methods to accomplish these tasks, but they should all be tracked in one place. This way, you know exactly how you've come to that final outcome of the issue, or you can collaborate more effectively as a team. It's really one place for everything, so that anyone can go into that one place, see what was said, how it was taken care of, and gain a better insight into how you came to that conclusion. Just like a story, where did it start, how did it turn around, and how does it end? But it has to be simple, right? I mean, so I think that's the biggest challenge for a lot of companies. You have to make it easy enough for people to want to communicate and collaborate in it. That's why it really needs to come to a real simple way of doing business. And really, this is about making sure nothing's lost and everyone is enrolled. And so part of the new ways of looking at quality and compliance, such as in these standards, is about enrolling more people in this quality conversation. So if you can make it centralized, make it easy to go in and contribute, you can have more participation, you can have more response and better ways to filter out the clutter and track the processes related to solving compliance challenges in a more meaningful way. So this really makes the conversations more smoother, more verbose, and provides as much detail without losing that time and effort that you have to go around it. So, you know, some of the elements that are always good to understand within the story quality are these three. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of different things that you can do. But when I start to think about the core elements that, you know, really want to round out that company-wide story, you look at harmonization. How can we get to a common, aligned process? The other is integration. So how can other areas of the business talk to quality, enhance that story? And then lastly, but certainly not least, is the way we should talk to the business around quality in adopting these risk-based thinkings as a means of communicating quality terms to the whole organization. So I'm going to start with harmonization because I think that's kind of the base level framework. So we're going to spend the next couple slides talking about harmonization. And so, you know, one of the realities of business today is that there's this constant pressure to diverge. You know, everything is forcing you to have different systems, and it's a natural progression of complexity in business. And so what you think of is, you know, factors like globalization introduces local differences, right, both at the regional level and country level. It could be very simple as languages as a divergence, but if you start to look deeper, you see that localized complexity is potentially present in different regulations and different regulatory agencies that you need to comply with in your products. Also, as we grow and expand, product variety keeps increasing. So you're going to have multiple variations of different products for different markets, and those introduce some technical differences in the way you produce them and the way your business is structured around those different products. And of course, there is always, as companies and markets move, there's this constant drumbeat of mergers and acquisitions as companies are extending their reach, and which ultimately introduces more business systems and more processes that might not be aligned. So one business that gets acquired has a different process or a different business system, and what tends to happen is we just keep those two systems running and we try and make sense of it and stitch them together. So here we are growing, increasing complexity and specializing different products, and what that natural byproduct becomes is not just a plethora of business systems that serve similar purposes, but you can actually have processes that drive quality. They're actually different. And so there's this divergence because people want to have the most adapted and best suited system for their individual needs. And so what typically happens is you create your own solution for your department or your area or your product line or manufacturing site or wherever you haven't found a suitable solution in the market. So you build these systems and processes from scratch using some sort of bare bones methodology just to get the job done. And the challenge becomes that they typically end up being very siloed, very inflexible, and they adhere to a very specific process which can be divergent and not aligned with other similar processes across the business. The other challenge that comes up is the not invented here syndrome, which really means that this other division or this other company that we're merging with or is acquiring us or we're working with doesn't really know what we do here, and they can't really understand what we need. They don't get our requirements, or they don't understand how the business process works. So that's why we have to have our own process variation to that corporate process, even though we're still in the same organization. And so there's this opportunity to harmonize, and even though we're kind of thinking in theory that harmonization is a good thing, there's always a lot of political resistance to that change, right? So there's typically already a significant investment already made inside those existing processes or those business processes from a business standpoint, and a lot of people that are dutifully employed in keeping those processes going. So why would we want to change? We have everything works fine the way it is, and it wasn't invented, here. So yeah. So that's some of the challenges that these enterprises face, but there's also a lot of benefits to harmonizing your processes. And you think about the differences and inconsistencies across the processes. And when you're looking to promote a cross-functional story of quality, you really want to make sure your processes are on the same page, especially if you're looking for a common compliance management, which really is looking for consistency in those processes. But switching over to harmonization doesn't mean a one-size-fits-all approach. I think the important thing to understand is you want to be able to promote best practices while also recognizing the differences. So we're not talking about uniform business processes. It's not that every division or functional area has to follow the exact same process, but really it's about identifying the best practices from the entire business and then allowing that fidelity to add on to those processes to meet unique needs of a division. Think of it like firming up the backbone of your process, and divisions can branch from that to have unique additional steps and workflows and different offshoots and so forth. But the main core best practice that would be agreed upon is intact and it's harmonized, but it really allows for the differences from site to site. The reality is that there's going to be, there may be very different businesses, but the 80% of it could be harmonized. And that's the challenge between having everything be separate and independent versus everything common. And I think there's this middle ground around harmonization that takes the 80-20 rule in some cases. Some companies may do 70-30, whatever it may be, but the bulk of your processes are consistent with a little bit of fidelity to diverge and have uniqueness to it. So let's talk a little bit about the reasons to harmonize. You know, before we even get there, we have to ask, is harmonization even possible? And it definitely is challenging. You know, I'm sure a lot of you are listening in and you're saying, oh, okay, great. How do I even put my head around this? And I think, you know, it's challenging depending on how many processes you have, how many different businesses are in your organization, how much variation across product lines you may have. And not only that, but people are going to resist change. And it starts to become a fight on which processes are most important, which ones are the main ones, which are considered best practices. And I think what ends up being the most critical part of any sort of harmonization effort is top-down commitment. So you really need to get buy-in at that top level because they're the ones going to be able to put pressure throughout the organization in forcing that common approach and promoting harmonization. If you can get that, there's a very powerful return on investment which really dramatically can reduce costs and result in much better compliance. And harmonization really allows you to control complexity. And we know the complexities are exploding and we just can't keep going in a siloed way as you grow. So, you know, the costs of complying in a complex business environment are much more prevalent, especially with the way that visibility into non-compliance is so much more prevalent in the consumer market, in any market. You know, 15, 20 years ago, if a small grower had a recall on lettuce, it may make the local news. It may make, you know, some people nervous in very far reaches of the country. But with social media, with 24-hour news, you know, these types of things, while they may not affect the entire country knows about it. So the idea that non-compliance can be localized in general is kind of gone. So the idea of being compliant, whether you're in a small scale or a large scale, is huge. And having common processes and common ways to understand it becomes more important. And so really it becomes this idea of a process that's harmonized and business systems that are able to talk to each other. You know, you want to be able to have that level of harmonization in that sense. And a lot of times companies, you know, look at the business systems to talk to each other. And the problem is that cost of integration of talking to these similar systems that serve, you know, dual purposes, what becomes an opportunity cost? What's the opportunity cost of missing integration? You know, you want to have data exchanged around historic quality, but you really need to have a quality management system that's integrating with other systems. And we'll talk about that. Additionally, I think what you want to be able to do is deliver better value. And by harmonizing your processes, you can deliver more value through simplification. And by simplifying the process, you can respond faster to changes. You can assimilate new businesses quicker, new product lines quicker, not just through acquisitions, but if you have a new market or new product line that you want to go into, you can kind of get a more consolidated view of what the compliance is going to be, what the processes are going to be. So harmonization allows you to get more of that consolidated view of compliance instead of having to go to multiple systems and try and map them together from a high-level perspective. So there's a lot of reasons to harmonize that drive better value. And, you know, it's really about understanding how different each division or each different processes. So if I have very common processes that are implemented for quality management, how do I know that this system that's used by one division is really all that different from another? It can be really different, and because different businesses are going to argue that it is different, and it has to be because they have unique business requirements. One of these things companies often do is they confuse or they merge the concept of business requirements to the compliance requirement, and they're usually very different things, right? You could be making very different products and have very different business processes, but you can have a fairly standardized, common, harmonized compliance process. You know, it's one of those problems I've noticed when companies implement a compliance management process like corrective action coupled with complaints, for example, is they embed a lot of business rules and functionality into the system that merge compliance requirements with the business, and explains why people really believe that their process is unique. So that becomes a huge challenge, and because you're trying to ask companies to separate their business process from compliance reports. And so I think having uniquely differentiated business processes becomes almost a competitive advantage, and you want to maintain that, and a business should constantly strive for that. But having unique differentiated compliance processes could leave room for non-compliance. So, you know, this type of integration, this type of harmonization is really especially important when you talk about linking to other systems. And you have this landscape of different systems out there, and some of them serve compliance purposes to maintain compliance, and some of them serve both compliance and business processes. And that's where it kind of becomes kind of muddy. But where you have a clean set of compliance systems, you can have harmonized compliance process that sits above and monitors all the unique different business systems. And it's kind of what this diagram shows is by separating that compliance layer from the business layer, you can still maintain unique systems with specialized processes for your different divisions. You can serve the different product lines and so forth and have this harmonized compliance process, which is integrating with all these different systems in order to exchange data and communicate. So, okay, this is all great. I have one common system for compliance. I have processes that are in support of that compliance requirement, and it can be rolled all over the world. You have a centralized IT support group to maintain the system, and you can really eliminate all the administrative bottlenecks as a result. And so the idea is by centralizing and having a harmonized singular process, you can really eliminate those bottlenecks and make a change into one system, one change, one system that connects to any other different business process we have. The other idea is that you also have a consistent worldwide experience. It really comes down to response time. When somebody's clicking on an action in Paris, for example, they can get the same kind of response as someone clicking in from New Jersey, and that goes down to the quality of the system and how well it utilizes this kind of compliance framework and compliance network. So just kind of summarize how harmonization kind of is a benefit. You know, for one, you're going to reduce the number of change requests because you're only looking at one system. You're looking at one thing. Everyone has their own system and constantly want to diverge. So remember, the pressures of diverging is never ending. So as long as you let them diverge in a way that you can make those changes more effectively. Harmonizing also reduces the number of changes and the cost of making those changes, as it exchanges once in a common system, and something I normally would do in multiple times if I need to implement the same change across all these other different systems. It also reduces the cost of support for obvious reasons. It reduces costs of system administration for the same reasons. And it also increases compliance with established processes and helps to increase the speed of rollout to new divisions. And that's going to be as much different exercise than starting with a blank piece of paper. You're already going to have those best practices, and you can, get in there a lot quicker. You can certainly increase the visibility across the enterprise, and you don't have to go into an extensive requirements gathering since you already know that you have a harmonized system and you know it's going to work. Now, you may have to look at that 20% or 30% that's different, and you can get access to the system in a very quick, efficient way to increase that response time. But when you do need to make a change, which is obviously going to be inevitable and will happen, you can determine that change quickly, and it increases knowledge sharing because it's essential in understanding the story of quality that we're sharing that knowledge across the different divisions, across the different product lines, across all those different things. So that's just a little something on harmonization. I think if I boiled it all down, it's all about kind of getting everybody on that same page, singing to the same sheet of music, telling the same story, with obviously some variation, but the compliance framework is set, and it's using best practices that all divisions, all product lines, all sites can benefit from, with having some level of flexibility and fidelity to shift and create some unique processes that are unique to those specific areas. Okay, let's talk a little bit about integration. So, if harmonization is about getting everybody in line and telling the story in the same direction, integration's about putting more content into the story and more details into the story. So some of you may have already taken steps to automate a quality management system. Some of you may have not. But the idea of when we do automate our quality, we're trying to replace some other system or manual paper with some sort of automated solution. And certainly automating quality is going to give you incremental improvements in that function, such as lowering your administration costs, dealing with electronic data instead of paper forms, reduction in the time to complete, routine and repetitive tasks, and also improve consistency in performing these quality processes and faster access to your data. So using software and technology specifically designed for automating quality system with full coverage of all your compliance needs and the tight links between those processes yields even higher returns. Usually these organizations get to that point and they stop there. But organizations can really achieve significantly higher returns if they leverage automation to tightly integrate quality with other business processes that rely on quality data. So this is because the effect of such an integration can have an immediate impact on, the results. So how many products are defective, and reduce the amount of inventory you're holding while defects are being investigated or being held to compensate for potential defects. It can speed up resolution of complaints, preventing potentially unknown defects from affecting other customers. It can provide you with the ability to go beyond simply improving compliance and quality to guaranteeing quality. But most of all, it gives you visibility into that full story of quality.
And Tim, if I can jump in real quick, just some clarification. Did you say something about increase response time to changes?
Yes, make your response type quicker. So maybe I
okay, make your response time quicker. Okay, that makes more sense. Okay.
Sorry. Okay. So business systems, typically are, people refer to them as enterprise software, right? But it's kind of a misnomer because it's almost always the case that a business system is usually sponsored and purchased and implemented by and for a specific department within the organization. So it's kind of designed to meet the requirements of a specific operational area with little regards to the entire enterprise, which spans all the departments. So you look at like MRP, MES, is really designed for operations and production department. Supply chain management systems are typically for purchasing and operations. CRMs are usually sales and customer service. PLMs, engineering, and the list goes on, right? So quality management is designed for quality and compliance departments. So it's not even the promise of these big systems, which are supposed to span the entire enterprise, as a solution to the problem, because they're usually deployed in this department or functional specific area, which can later make integrations a little bit more difficult, because they've already kind of built it the way they need to be built. So how do you get the data out? How do you get the data in? So, I think business systems, in this sense, kind of almost reinforce this natural tendency not to share information. They already have in these different areas this narrow view because that's what they're focused on, and they're trying to achieve their goals. So it really drives what they're trying to do in every department. So implementing business systems usually always support their overall departmental objectives. So it kind of isolates the department from the rest of the organization, especially from a system. So what you end up with is kind of these information silos, right? And they're typically delineated by department, and these information silos are so neatly and efficiently automated by the business systems that support them, so it makes it even less accessible to other departments. And so the result, obviously, is the information doesn't always flow efficiently between departments. Important information is not available when it's needed by the people who need it. And the enterprise-wide view of that information becomes very difficult, if not impossible. So, nevertheless, really, information silos have to be broken down in this day and age. I mean, sharing business information becomes a necessity because these individual departments are part of an information chain in support of your organization's products and services. So every link in that chain, every piece of that story relies on information upstream and downstream. And that communication between the departments is a daily affair. So the problem is that information silos make the communication very difficult and inefficient. You know, these inefficiencies become apparent in a lot of routine activities that I've seen. You know, information that gets printed from these systems in the forms of reports and literally carried to the other business system manually. Then they're re-entered by hand by, you know, double entry of data. You know, the business system where data is entered doesn't know anything about the other one, so it can't check to see if the data is still valid since it was printed. And there's no feedback based on processes and rules, so the information is only flowing one way. And sometimes the data in one system won't even fit into the new system. You know, one area, one business system might be considered high, it may be called critical in another, or the product types may be different. You know, the operators end up having to make that translation themselves, so kind of leads to all sorts of interesting and potentially problematic results. You know, departments are doing their best to push and pull information to and from other departments, but given that isolated nature of those systems, the process is full of you know, inefficiencies and laden with risk. And, you know, the quality department is not an exception to this rule, right? I mean, it needs data from other departments, and it produces data that's needed by the rest of the organization. So without this integration, you know, quality operators must maintain separate lists for customers, suppliers, products, equipment, any other reference information entered into their quality records. And it needs to be regularly updated to keep up with any changes, and they must manually create these nonconformance reports based on printed defect results. So, you know, a lot of them will arrive at one time, or they're entered sporadically. It becomes overwhelming. So, you know, you think about all these things about maintaining this. The other quality soil also contains these critical business data for the rest of the organization. So the production department needs to know whether a defective product can be taken off hold and scrapped, reworked, or released as is. The customer service department needs to relay the results of an investigation on waiting customers. The procurement department needs to know how many vendors are approved to purchase from and which one needs special terms. So, you know, same thing with quality. Many departments need to know all the quality and compliance tasks in a change control process are completed before they can start a new production run. And certainly managers throughout the organization want to prevent these unqualified people from doing critical tasks. So these are just some examples of how quality and compliance information impacts the rest of the organization. And I think a lot of organizations underestimate the importance of this information, which is why, you know, the quality and compliance departments usually last on the list of the integration process, and I think that's a costly mistake. And I think the change becomes integrating quality as the center, the hub of a lot of what other integrated areas are kind of building into. And so integrating the quality management system with these other business systems can create this dramatic benefit that go far beyond the boundaries of just quality. So there's a host of improvements. You know, you think about the status of a defective product can be automatically updated as soon as the decision is made in that quality system. You don't have manual input, no mistakes, no delay, means faster production cycles, reduced inventory, easier production planning. You know, the customer service personnel can see the current status and final results of the complaint investigations, so they can respond to customer inquiries more effectively and use that information to flag future critical complaints before they're escalated into investigation. Same thing with the procurement department. They have access to approved vendors that automatically checks for the presence and status of defect reports, corrective actions, or audits related to each vendor, giving the latest information. Any tasks in other business systems can kind of check the compliance status of a specific piece of equipment or a product, and display if it's not ready for use. And similarly, from a training perspective, you can automatically check on the current training status of any sort of operator to stop the operation if they're not sufficiently trained, or just prompt them to review the latest revision of a work instruction. Lack of training or operator error tends to be some of the more common quality issues in many organizations. That integration alone can have a far-reaching impact on overall quality. So hopefully you kind of get the whole sense of where integration can benefit, and I think certainly understanding the benefits of integration is certainly a lot simpler than actually realizing them. And obviously, I think if you've been in the quality space before, you know integration is not easy. But it's important to understand that the rewards of integration make that cost worthwhile, because the reason why integration becomes difficult and why there's a lot of resistance is because a lot of times business systems tend to be incompatible. By default, they don't necessarily talk to each other. Some of them are designed for it, some of them are not. And even if you can get them to talk, they might not understand each other because you have, it's designed for a single department in mind. Integration probably wasn't a big consideration when it was put in. But slowly things are changing, and that's great because nowadays there's this plethora of integration technologies that exist that will link practically any two business systems together. And now it's still a challenge, and there's still some mapping and still some ideas, but it has become much, much easier in the last few years. And there's two ways that companies typically look to integrate business systems, and it's usually point-to-point or using some level of middleware. And point-to-point generally connects one business system directly to another through what they call application programming interfaces. And so, having that kind of connection allows you to kind of map those areas to go, and it creates a much more lower-cost way of connecting them. And a lot of companies now build out these application programming interfaces for their solutions, and now you can have a much more conversation between those two systems. Middleware is kind of using a third system to kind of act as an intermediary between the two systems. It's kind of like a broker that connects them together, and it manages the flow. So they come with these connectors that put it into this middle table that kind of makes sure that everything is validated and put together, and then it pushes it out. It's generally a more expensive option to go because you're putting in those tools in there, but ultimately it delivers better performance. It's got more monitoring. It's got easier maintenance. So once you've kind of gone through that, you see that these companies are starting to really provide the options for different systems to talk to each other. You've now created this harmonized system, and you're getting everybody on the same page, and now you've kind of built in an integration to put more content into that story of quality. The challenge now becomes one of communication. So how can you actually communicate that story of quality with other areas of the business? How do you speak? What's the language that you output quality to? What can we make common as a language that everybody can understand? People don't always speak quality, so the idea becomes risk-based thinking, and that risk speak is kind of where the conversation kind of takes its language and how it's translated. So we're going to spend the last half of this, or last part of this, just kind of talking a little bit about what risk-based thinking is and kind of how to take quality-related data, turn it into risk-based data. So before I jump into kind of how to figure out risks and how to build risk into your existing processes and how to output as risk, it's good to kind of take a step back and understand the process of risk management. So I'm looking at this standard called the ISO 31000, And it's a very broad standard, and it's not something you necessarily adhere to all business operations, but it's good as a general interpretation of how risk management processes work. So risk management starts with the identification of any relevant risks. So you look at your operations, you determine where the hazards are and what the exposure to the hazards are to come up with a risk. And it's certainly not done in a vacuum. You want to assemble a risk team to help identify these risks throughout your operation. Then you want to take your known risks and you want to do two things, basically. You want to determine a way to quantify those risks, so you look for ways to measure it in a systematic and objective way, and a lot of people use scales like severity or probability. And then you want to implement a process for evaluating and assessing risk. So this is where kind of that risk assessment piece, which is different from risk, it's a portion of risk management, and it kind of plays its part in the whole risk management process. Now, the key point of risk is, more than anything, is to come to a decision as a result from your assessment. So you can use tools out there to help quantify and filter risk, but ultimately you need to make the decision on how you're going to handle it. There's many factors. You can accept it, you can reduce it, you can use compensation, you can transfer it, or if the risk is simply too much, you may avoid it. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those are as we go further. But ultimately, once you've made a decision, you're going to need to implement that. And that usually arises as a management of changes or to processes or operations, or implementing controls to mitigate or reduce risk, or any improvement activities that can ultimately support your decision. And that's kind of risk management in a high level. And the reason why risk becomes a really great tool for an entire operation to get enrolled around quality or anything for that matter is that it is it's pervasive throughout all areas within an organization, right? It spans everything from quality to safety to regulatory to financial to commercial, anything. Risk management is like an umbrella that kind of spans that enterprise. So that's why it's really powerful in concept. We can use risk as a universal methodology for benchmarking compliance in the organization around our products, our services, anything. So why risk? Why even, why do it? And I think, what makes it so powerful is that it's repeatable and it's objective, and it puts everything in its operational context. It allows you to apply event-based data in a risk-based approach. It replaces kind of that subjectiveness, the gut feel, with more guided decision-making approach. And it's also easy to understand for people who aren't necessarily initiated into different processes. In some cases, it's just color-coded, and I think that really is powerful. It helps to drive change, too, both in a short-term and long-term context. And so what you're doing is you're kind of building risks for critical events and wrapping guidelines and decisions around them. And it creates like a solution for risk levels that aren't acceptable, and they become systematic and repeatable, and you can implement solutions for high risks in a more automatic and consistent manner. But it's important to understand that risk and risk assessment and the whole process of risk is just kind of a means to an end. It's not the ultimate solution. Like any tool that's out there, any methodology is out there, you have to be careful of falling into a false sense of security and relying on that alone. In some cases, someone on the shop floor may see something as critical risk and escalate it, and the risk may not be so bad in the larger context of operations. So risk needs to be universal in this sense, not a matter of opinion. So you need to continually test your risk assessments and risk management processes with content and data and tweak those tools with those data. A lot of times you want to have a team in place to kind of vet those tools and make sure that you're achieving the right results. Because as your operations change or more business systems get integrated, more harmonization fills in, you may find that the risk levels need to be adjusted just as you would with anything in your operation. So the last section here I'm going to cover, I'm just going to kind of go through kind of how to build risk into the QMS and kind of create outputs that push it out into a risk-based context. It's a process like anything else, and it's not only is it repeatable, objective, and standardized, but it can be embedded into your existing processes. It does not have to replace your process. And so really, just at a high level, the first goal here is to identify the risks within your operations, then determine how you're going to measure those risks and evaluate them, and then you want to figure out treatment options on your risk, how you're going to treat them, and eventually you're going to want to implement actions and controls to address these risks. So let's break it down step by step. So the first and most common thing I'm always asked when I talk about risk and risk planning and risk-based thinking is, how do I even start identifying my risks? And so really what you want to do is you want to examine your existing operations, not just in quality, but overall. And you want to seek out potential hazards within those operations and categorize them. And so what you end up doing is you say, okay, well, how do I even do that? You ask. You go and you survey, you audit your operations just like you normally would, but figure out the potential hazards from all areas of the business. What are the problems that could occur, and how likely are they to occur? So hazard and the probability of exposure to that hazard. And the result is you'll probably get a lot of hazards and a host of different exposures or probabilities to them. And the key really here is to collect and analyze these hazards and then categorize them. We call this a taxonomy of risk, and it's really just general areas of hazard types in a broader context. And you can make better sense of everything from that kind of taxonomy. And then you can kind of create these general scales of severity of these hazards and their frequency or likelihood to occur. And then you can have more variability, but it's the easiest and most logical way to identify and organize the overall risk levels. Once you have that, you can start to evaluate your risks. So you now have this list of hazards, you've categorized them, you've organized them, you've built some probabilities around them. You can now calculate your risk. Well, how? Well, there's several ways to assess risk, and there's a lot of common tools out there, and we've done webinars about that. I have lots of details on the different types. But the bottom line is that you're doing some sort of level of calculation of the components of risk, of components of the hazard and their severity to quantify risk. And so the idea is that math becomes tricky, and it's not automatic. So if you're doing a calculation and the math is showing one thing, you want to be careful on relying on that alone. So too often I hear people implementing a risk assessment tool that uses math to calculate risk, and they just kind of leave it to the tool to determine the risk. And the reality is that the tool's there to help guide decisions and risk calculations, but the ultimate decision on how to handle risk come from people. The tool's there as a guide, but most people will test their risk tools with real-world past data. They'll gather a risk team and review these calculations to confirm that the calculations actually reflect what would have been done in that real world. So some tweaking of that math has to be necessary, but the treatment of risk should really be a combination of people, processes, and the tool. So you've created this list of hazards and the probabilities, and you've come up with a slick risk assessment strategy that combines quantitative analysis with real-world data. Then what? Well, just because you calculated something as a high risk doesn't mean you've solved the problem. You just know you have a high risk. So what you want to do is assign treatment options to that risk. You want to you need to determine what you're going to do if there is a risk, and you do this in several ways. Again, this is where having cross-functional teams to kind of translate all these becomes really handy. You can review the different risk outcomes and then determine, maybe based on the past data or based on processes, how you're going to handle the different risk levels. In any event, here's the treatment levels again. So accept it, right? You say, okay, it's worth the risk. The risk is low enough, it's okay. You can seek ways to reduce it. So in other words, you can take steps to mitigate the risk. You can put controls in place, things like that. You can use the notion of compensation. You can find ways to insure yourself against the risk. You can transfer. So you can perhaps source it out to a partner or a supplier with a different management system that has a better handle on things. Or if the risk is simply too much, you may want to just avoid it. Just stop the process altogether. It's too high risk. And so every company is going to have a different way of treating their risks, and it's really up to that risk team to determine which ways to interpret the risk levels. But once you do, you need to take action on it. So which brings me to the last step in the process, which is taking action on risk. And it's one thing to have a risk management process that grabs these hazards and probabilities, it quantifies them into risk, it provides you guidance on the level of risk and how to treat it. It's a totally other thing to take the next step and figure out how to go about acting on those risks. And this is where you really need to incorporate the quality management processes into the dynamic, or to broaden it, the whole quality story needs to be brought into that dynamic. You can kick off corrective and preventive actions based on a risk level or a risk treatment. You can also launch actions from risk levels to create management of change or action plans to address issues. But lastly, you also want to have reporting in place to analyze risks over time so you can see where your top risks are and how you're doing overall as an organization in mitigating risk. And I'll talk a little bit about more on risk reporting because that kind of rounds out the story. I'll talk about that in a minute. But that's it in a nutshell. I mean, building a risk management plan is just kind of another process, and it's one that doesn't need to be difficult per se. It does certainly take time and effort to set up, especially if you don't already know your hazards. But once you do, you can use these risk processes and these risk tools as a quantitative, objective, and systematic means of making more informed decisions using a repeatable method. So
Tim, before we move on, Tim, just real quick, before we move on, just a reminder to people, if you have questions, it's time to queue them up. Just use the Q&A box in the lower right corner of your screen, or the green drop-down menu at the top of your screen. Click that, and you'll see a Q&A button. You can click that and send questions to Tim. We'll get to him in a bit. Thanks, Tim.
Cool. Thanks, Dirk. Okay, so you might be saying, okay, that's all fine and good, but it doesn't answer one thing. How am I supposed to document this and prove it, say, in an audit or an inspection? So here you have this process of risk management that's probably incorporated into your existing process. So generally speaking, document what you're doing and then document when you actually do it. So the whole risk management process should be documented, should be controlled, and it should be built with work instructions and roles. It should be standard, especially when you introduce new elements into an existing process. And so for each step, you're conducting activities that will be documented. It'll have traceability, and you can tie it to your overall quality program. So when you're looking to identify the hazards and categorize and build out risks for them, this should be recorded in results of your audits, your surveys, analysis. You should also be documenting the process by which you've built the risk measurement. Then you're building evaluation and treatment on the risks you need to control. You need to document each time it's incorporated into a record. So it's really about having traceability. And so whether you're doing this manually, digitally, or through some sort of solution, the traceability of that process and the practice of the process is key. And it rings true when you're taking action. So you think of the case, okay, you've issued a corrective action. Okay, how did that get escalated? How did it become there? What's that story? Was it from another event? Did you calculate risk in that event? It should all be recorded. It should all be a component of the story. And it's all part of that process, and it's kind of very simply stated in any of these standards right now. So any one of these steps that we've been talking about could be considered risk-based thinking, and it can apply. And just lastly, before I kind of pop off of this, you know, I've talked a lot about kind of the risky side of things, you know, the bad, if you will. But, you know, the standard also mentions opportunities too. So what the process can also do is not only look for the threats to your compliance, it can also help uncover potential but not yet realized hazards. Things that might not be risks today, but it could potentially be a risk in the future. So you could have a hazard that has a low probability, and thus the risk is inherently low, but does that mean we ignore it? No, probably not. We should take this as an opportunity to preventatively mitigate any potential risk and seek continual improvement. So we can look for new ways to improve long-term, you know, implement management of change, process improvements, mitigation activities. You know, there's a lot of tools out there in the risk world like FMEA or Bowtie that deal specifically in more preventative aspects of risk. But you should always take your hazards and identify whether this becomes a risk or an opportunity for improvement in a more preventative way. So if you think about this and just kind of rounding this out, what I think the value of risk-based thinking and risk becomes, it allows you to measure decisions that affect compliance. And as I stated before, knowing where your risks are at a higher level organization becomes really important. And so as you measure and take actions, you're building a history of risk within your organization. And this becomes valuable data that you can fine-tune operations based on a history of risk. And so the idea is that you have this library that kind of gets built with all this risk data from all different areas, and it becomes a centralized area where you can see all the risk. It's taking operations that potentially are harmonized, that have integrated with other data that's coming in, and it's spitting out as a risk report, as a report saying, hey, through the use of these different processes, these different business systems, we've managed to review our quality system and we review quality, and the story shows these are the top risks where it is. And it becomes a critical component, and you know, these operational areas are going to be able to contribute to that story. Certainly not all operational areas are going to have the same exact type of risk, but what the risk register and risk reporting does, it provides that common area from all your operations to look how risk is evolving over time. You can analyze and trend where the high risks are, where you need to provide more oversight, how you can improve operations, and using risk as kind of the benchmark for how the story of quality ends and how the story of quality has evolved. So, you know, if we look at the story of quality in this state that we've kind of gone through, we now have a system that is able to extend to more areas. So, you know, the harmonization, right? It's about getting on the same page. The divergent processes helps to create this common framework for compliance and have everyone operate in the same manner. It doesn't necessarily mean a shift in unique business processes, but more of a singular place for a common backbone of quality processes, compliance processes to follow, with key areas that are unique to the business, following that kind of 80% common, 20% unique rule. Then you want to look at how the other business systems contribute to quality and add more content to that story. We do this through integration, taking these key business systems that feed into quality. And, you know, there's a lot more progress in how you can plug into those systems and create that connection and create a story that's much more rounded out and adds more. Through integration, you can create a story that is enterprise-wide and not siloed. And the last, in obviously the new complex world we live in order to have a story that everyone in the business can effectively read, we need to put it into terms that are applicable to the entire business. So risk-based thinking helps to create a risk story that will take quality-related information and level it out as risk, which can be consumed by the entire organization and consumable to everybody. Not everybody's going to speak quality, but they will speak risk. And by doing that, everyone can get on board and understand and contribute to the story of quality, resulting in a better alignment to quality as almost a driving force for improvement and kind of create this company-wide culture in quality. So that was a lot to take in, I know. Hopefully it was helpful. And obviously, before I open up for questions, just wanted to mention that my company, ETQ, provides businesses with comprehensive quality management platform. Not only provides that visibility and control of the quality processes, but links risk-based thinking with quantitative tools and has technology that aligns with harmonization integration stories that we mentioned in the webinar. So, that being said, Dirk, I'm happy to do any questions. I know we're running low.
Yep, we got some time here. We can go a little over if that's okay with you. And we do have some questions that come in. If you didn't hear my earlier explanation, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A box in the lower right corner of your screen, or you might have a green drop-down menu at the top of your screen. Mouse over that, click Q&A. That'll open up the Q&A box. Okay. Question: can risk reduction be determined in a quantifiable way so as to prevent having the same discussion over and over, or does the absence of a defect, an injury, downtime, et cetera, only mean we've been lucky so far?
Yeah, so what risk is going to tell you is if you're reducing the risk, it doesn't necessarily mean that the probability is gone. It could just, you could, by reducing your risk, you still may have a defect rate, or if you have 0 defects, it doesn't necessarily mean that one won't come. What risk is kind of measuring is saying that if your probability was high and the risk was high, and through risk reduction you got the probability to low, but the risk is still, the potential is still high, for, you know, the hazard is still high. It doesn't mean that you've completely eliminated the risk. It just means that you've taken steps to get to 100% defect-free. So that's where really you start to look at more preventative aspects to it. So what typically I always say is, if you go in and you look at, and we'll use defect rate, if you look at, you have a defect rate that has a high severity and a high probability, and you take mitigation steps to reduce that risk to still high severity but much more lower probability, you're almost entering into the opportunity phase. If you've gotten it down to an acceptable level of risk and you want to go for 0 defect, now you have to start saying, okay, well, what preventative actions can we take, or opportunities, as the standard says, what opportunities can we look for to keep driving that down even further to get to that 0 defect rate. So it doesn't automatically assume that if you reduce the risk that you are never going to have a problem. It just means that the probability has gotten much lower, and now it becomes almost an opportunity for even further improvement.
This is a great question, and everybody always asks this. Could you explain again how opportunities can be seen through risk? Opportunities.
Yeah. So I look at this in 2 different facets, right? So if I'm going in doing my hazards exercise and I see something that has a high the severity in the hazard. So what is the severity of this hazard? It's really high. And what is the probability that this hazard is going to occur? It's really low. It almost never happens. So there's 2 schools of thought to that, right? You say, okay, well, it's an acceptable level of risk. We can say, okay, that's fine. We'll move on. Or you say, well, if it only happens once in a blue moon, that's not good enough for me. I see it as an opportunity for us to go in and say, well, how can we get that to negligible, which is probably the lowest most people go, is negligible. It's literally non-existent. So that becomes one area of an opportunity. So you say, okay, yes, I looked at it. I said my hazard's really high, but probability is really low. You know, I still think I should go in and look at the process and say, where could things potentially go wrong in that once in a blue moon, you know, area, 0 defect. If you're trying to go for 0 defect, then, you know, even low probabilities become opportunities for improvement. The second part of that, the second kind of way to look for opportunities is that, let's say I have site A that I've done I got a nonconformity that happened on my production line in site A, and I see that I've gone through my corrective action process, I've assessed the risk, it's a high risk, I have to make a decision on it, I have to do all these things. I start looking over at site B and C who have similar conditions but have never had that incident happen, have never had that nonconformity. I see it as an opportunity to jump over there and be preventative in nature and say, I'm going to fix the equipment here, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to train, I'm going to do all these things. So there's the idea of saying something is low operationally, but because I'm going for 0 defect, or I'm trying to, not have any sort of risk whatsoever, I'm going to take a preventative approach to that. Or I'm encountering it at site A, or I'm encountering it on product line A, and I have similar conditions elsewhere. While they haven't encountered that risk, I'm going to be preventative. I'm going to take that as an opportunity to fix whatever potential latent problems there might be.
Okay, you kind of touched on this one earlier, but maybe flesh it out a bit. How much should we rely on the quantitative information provided by a QMS to measure risk, and how much on other pieces of information, such as further reports, external information that came from suppliers, and so forth?
I would say, again, going back to the idea of a risk tool being a tool. It's just another way for you to be more systematic in nature. And some people will build in tools to rely on multiple facets. So you could easily say, okay, well, I'm going to build a tool saying, okay, if the complaint has these conditions and the risk is high, we're going to do an immediate corrective action. We're going to correct, it escalates to the top. We're going to do corrective action. You may have one that you may have the similar complaint that the risk is middle of the road, or it's not inherently risky. It has a lower risk. The tool is going to tell you that it's not necessarily a corrective action. Maybe it's an immediate correction. However, you could build in another facet that says, okay, if it's from supplier X, and this is the third time supplier X has, been the materials that were in part of this particular complaint, obviously the supplier risk level should go up. So suppliers would have their own risk levels, and then you would take a supplier corrective action at that point. So there's a lot that can kind of branch off of these things, but a general rule of thumb is that when you do risk assessments and risk management in these contexts to filter out specific quality events, you're not only looking at the tool as a guidance to tell you what the tool says you should do, you're also kind of saying as a team, and I have customers that go in and they assemble a risk team once a week or whatever it is, and they go through whatever complaints or whatever quality events are in there, and they'll run the risk tool, and then they'll say, are there any other factors? Are there any other things that we need to consider with this particular event before we say it's a corrective action or it's not a corrective action? So it definitely becomes a combination of people, processes, and the tool itself.
Okay. How would you use the idea of risk as a means to persuade a CEO to invest in the type of QMS software that you've been describing?
Yeah, that's always the $50 million question. Sometimes literally the $50 million question. I had a cartoon we did a few years ago where, quality managers sitting at a CEO's desk and saying, by implementing a quality system, we can reduce the number of CAPAs by 30%, and we can, reduce nonconformities and all these things. And the thought bubble under the CEOs is, what's a CAPA? And that's really where it comes down to, is that, you're trying to justify quality to the business, and that always becomes a challenge, especially when they don't speak the language of quality. And I think what you end up doing is saying, okay, well, you're reducing your CAPAs, you're reducing the number of corrective actions that come in, or late corrective actions, or anything like that by a certain percentage. What's the ultimate risk? So why are you doing that? Because you're trying to impact the bottom line. You're trying to be more efficient. You're trying to produce better products that start at the beginning. What's the overall risk to the business if you don't have a system in place to do this quicker? You have more late CAPAs. If you have more late CAPAs, you're pushing out products that potentially will encounter more defects, that will affect returns and warranties, that ultimately end up on the bottom line, because C-level management cares about the bottom line, right? They want to make sure that the product they're pushing back isn't coming back to them in a defect manner. At the same time, they want to make sure that their reputation as an organization is coming out clean to the market. So, you can take that in the form of whatever is most important to the organization from a strategic standpoint. Is it reducing recalls? Is it customer loyalty? Is it reducing warranty claims? How does quality contribute to that story, and how can you reduce the risk of warranty claims, or how can you reduce the risk of, the different areas, recalls and things like that? And I think that's where risk thinking kind of takes that turn, where you say, rather than saying, hey, if I do this, I can reduce the open CAPAs to almost nothing. I can always have my CAPAs on time. To saying, hey, if we get a quality management system, we're going to be way more efficient. We're going to be able to respond to events faster. Less defective product is going to get shipped. Less warranty, less returns, better customer satisfaction. and more revenue. So that's just one small-scale example, but it's typically how most companies justify it in a risk context.
Okay. And, well, we're about 10 after here, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Once again, Tim, thanks for a great presentation.
No problem.
Okay, and thanks to all of you as well for joining us today. You will be receiving an email with a link to a recording of this webinar as well as a PDF of the slides within about a day, so keep your eyes open for that email. And, well, that's it. So from all of us here at Quality Digest and at ETQ, you all have a great day, and we will see you at the next webinar. So long.